Hey, great to have you back in this section. In our previous topics we learned about vectors and matrices. Here, we will go one step ahead and take an overview on data frames and lists. In our previous sections, we learned what vectors and matrices are. Let's try to remember them. Vectors are a group of elements of similar data type. Similarly, when we group elements of similar data type arranged in rows and columns, we get a matrix. Now, what if I have data which has names as well as the ages of students? How should I store them together? Data frames to the rescue. In data frames, we can store any data together. Now, data frames are a group of elements stored in rows and columns which can store any type of data. It looks similar to an Excel data sheet which has column names defining what the data is and has unique row names. Let's work through an example to understand this better. Let's take the example of a data frame student_list which contains details of students such as student ID, student name, age, and department. Now, since this is a data frame, we are able to store numeric values such as student ID and age as well as character values such as student name and department in a single structure. So, in a data frame, we can store all types of data in a single two-dimensional structure. We can also see there are names provided for each column. This tells us more about the data stored in that column. Imagine, if we did not have column names. Wouldn't it be difficult to interpret what the data in the column represents? So it's always good practice to name your rows and columns uniquely. We hope you have understood the difference between a matrix and a data frame. Let's solve some quiz questions to understand it better. Now that we know what a data frame is, let's move on to our next topic, i.e. how to create a data frame. As with a matrix, we can create data frames using vectors but of different values. So, we combine these vectors together inside a function and we get a brand new data frame. Simple, isn't it? Let's see the syntax to create a data frame. Now that we know what data frames are, let's try and create them. The syntax here says, we have a function called data.frame. This function is used to create a data frame. It requires parameters such as column names and their corresponding values. We can add as many columns as we want by separating them with a comma. Let's work through an example to understand this better. Let's take the student list which we saw earlier and understand how we can create a data frame out of it. Remember the functions such as sequence, combine which we used for vectors? Let's use them to create a data frame which has 4 columns, namely student_ID, student_name, age, and department. So, let's break down the code bit by bit. We are using a sequence function to create the student_ID. Then we are using a combine function on each column to create the student_name, age, and department. We are then separating all these columns with a comma. Data.frame function will take these inputs and create a beautiful data frame called student_list. So, using data.frame function we can create a data frame quickly and easily. We hope by now you have a better understanding of data frames. Let's go ahead with the quiz section to understand this better. We hope you now have a clear understanding of what data frames are and how we can create them. Now, let's move on to our next topic, i.e. lists. We all go through a phase where we collect up all our old stuff and store it inside a box so that down the line, we can open that box and relive those memories whenever we want to. With so many vectors, matrices and data frames created, how should we keep track of what data is essential and what is not? If only there was a way in which we can store all our data in one place and access it whenever we want. Yes. Using lists you can store whatever data you have and access it anytime you want. Sounds interesting. Let's dive in to understand this better. In the previous topic we learned that data frames can store multiple types of data in 2 dimensions. Now, lists are something in which we can store values, vectors, matrices and a data frame all together in a single file. The question that arises here is why on earth would we need such a generic thing in our programming? The answer is quite simple. The purpose of a list is to store other objects, i.e. it is used to store sets of data in a single place so that we can access them whenever we want rather than searching for them individually. Let's use an example to understand this better. We have a data frame which contains the details of students from class 8. We also have a vector which contains a list of subjects these students have in their syllabus. Now, we cannot combine both sets of data as the syllabuses have nothing to do with the student details, but there will come a time when we would need them together. Hence, we can store them together in a list and access them at the same time whenever we want. We hope you can now relate to the purpose of lists in R. Let's take a quick quiz to understand it better. Now that we know what a list is, let's move on to our next topic, i.e. how to create a list in R. Let's start by understanding the syntax needed to create a list. We have a function called list which is used here. Inside the function, we can add any number of vectors, matrices or data frames as well as being able to declare single variables. Let's work through an example to understand this better. Let's say we have a vector v, a matrix m, a data frame df and a variable num and we need to store them together in a single place. This is where we use lists. Now, let's see how we can create a list using the list function. Now, we can create a list, our first list, by running the below command. Our first list equals list v, m. The result will contain everything mentioned in the list function. Let's look at the output which we get when we run the above code. If we look at the output here, we can see how all the values are stored inside the same list but they are separate enough to be easily distinguished. We hope you now have a better understanding of lists in R programming. Let's take a quiz to understand this better. We hope you now have a good grasp on the basics of data frames and lists. Let's have a quick revision of the topics we have covered up until now. We started by learning the concept of data frames. Then we created a data frame using the data.frame function. We then moved to our second topic about lists where we discussed the use of lists in R. In the last topic, we saw how we can create lists using the list function. Congratulations on completing this course. We hope you now have a clear understanding about the basics of R programming. We will cover both data frames and lists in detail in our next course on R programming. Until then, happy coding.